Hello and welcome. This is Pastor Ken Ortize, and this is the beginning of a new week of our regular ongoing series called the Morning Devotionals. And if you are just joining us, welcome. We're glad to have you here. Particularly, we want to remember those who are throughout the Midwest and even here on the West Coast who are dealing with some significantly high temperatures most of us are not accustomed to, and I pray that things are going well and you're keeping cool. Also, I want to mention that every Monday, just about, I tend to display a new T-shirt, and I've skipped the last couple of weeks because I ran out of contributions. But this week I have a new T-shirt, and I have another one for next week as well. And so for those of you who enjoy this is one that was given to me by our bookkeeper at our church, and it simply reads, normal isn't coming back, Jesus is. And so I thought that was pretty insightful, pretty good, even though many of us would like to see things return to what we had just even a few years ago before the faux-demic was foisted upon us. We know that rarely is that the case. So our abnormal reality in this country is becoming normalized, and most of us aren't really thrilled with it. We would like things to change, but the reality is that our only hope, ultimately, our ultimate hope, I should say, is the second coming of Jesus Christ. And our lives as human beings in this world will be completely out of sync, our entirety of our lives, simply because we weren't made for this world. It's one of those concepts, I think, that a lot of us don't recognize or realize, is that, mankind was created to live in a world that was sinless. And by man's transgression, sin entered into the world, and the influence and, in many places, the dominion of Satan began to express itself over this world and over the governments of this world. And mankind has suffered ever since. And I think in some ways, we who live in America today and are going through difficult times or having trouble, covering many of our expenses, and as everything goes up in price, yet at the same time, we have to understand that we're still living at a standard that exceeds probably 99.9% of humanity throughout history. So we have a great deal to be thankful for. I think as one observer put it recently, gave me some pause to think, was that he says, every time you take a shower, realize that 100 years ago, even the most powerful, wealthy men in the world never experienced anything so enjoyable as a nice warm shower. So it's something to really give thought to. We have this kind of misconception in our culture that really grew up during the Enlightenment of the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century of what we call the noble savage, that somehow people lived this life of simplicity and nobility and health. Their life was completely organic. And the reality is that never existed. I mean, ever since the fall, death, disease, and other things have disasters and destruction have plagued mankind, and in many cases have wiped out entire civilizations. So you and I have a lot to be thankful for, even if we realize that things could easily be better if it wasn't for the incredible stupidity that's too stupid to be stupid. There has to be an intentionality in it. So as our current president said recently in his interview with George Stephanopoulos, our nation is at an inflection point. And an inflection point means a turning point. You're going to go in one direction or the other. And most of us would like to turn around and go back where we were just 4 or 5 years ago. But instead, there are people who want to take us to what they tell us is a bright, new, greater future. But it has every marking of being one that is darker, more difficult, more depressing, and less livable. And for the elites, it's the ultimate goal. If you want to get more of my perspective on that, you could just check out at my website, kenortiz.com, my latest podcast that I put up, which I call The New Marxism. And you might find it of interest. So I recommend it to you. But anyway, let's get on with our morning devotionals. We left off last week looking at 1 Peter chapter 2, and we're getting near the end of the chapter. I touched on verse 21, but didn't really get a chance to expound on it, and I want to do that this morning. Chapter 2, verse 21 reads this way: "For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that we should follow his steps." If that sounds familiar, that phrase, follow his steps, it may be because you're familiar with a book that was written in 1896 by a congregational pastor by the name of Charles Sheldon. And he published the book entitled In His Step, and he predicated it basically on this particular passage, this last phrase in this passage. The title was taken from this passage and had a subtitle that also may sound very familiar to you, is "What Would Jesus Do?" If that sounds familiar, it's because you're aware of the bracelet that was going around that had WWJD on it that many people were wearing. And basically, this book that sold over 50 million copies, I mean, it's one of the best-selling books in the history of publishing, basically was based on Sheldon's predicate that as Christians, we should not do anything without first asking the question, what would Jesus do? Now, how you answer that question is dependent, really, or at least how accurately you answer that question is based upon your knowledge of the Word of God. And I say that in the age where an increasing number of Christians are what we call biblically illiterate and unfamiliar with Scripture, they have a few phrases that have been published to them that they saw on Instagram or Facebook, or maybe was a phrase that was thrown out during a sermon on a Sunday morning or whatever. You may not have a very well-formed idea of how Jesus dealt with the everyday issues of life. But the verse itself presents us with a very important challenge, I think, because the very first thing he tells us about how Jesus dealt with stuff was that, first of all, he did it in the face of suffering. And we live in an era where people are doing everything they can to avoid any kind of suffering whatsoever. In fact, they are so distorted in their thinking that they believe that if there's any suffering, any hardship, any difficulty in their life, then something is wrong, somebody has done them wrong, and it's the obligation of the rest of the world to fix their problem and make them live happily ever after. One thing we see in life of Jesus, if you've studied it as I have, and I'm sure many of you have, he didn't surf through life. I mean, he was not just jumping on the current and riding the wave. He went against the current. He rebuked the prevailing ungodly cultural narrative. He spoke the truth, and he spoke it in love, but he did speak the truth. And it's amazing to me how I find that there is in our time just a penchant in many places for pulpits to kind of massage the message in a way so that it's not offensive. It's kind of like what I referred to years ago. I came up with this term, probably not originally me, but I thought it was. I call it stealth evangelism, where you sneak up on people and get them saved before they knew what got a hold of them. And what I found with that kind of approach is it not only didn't really get a hold of them, but it really didn't even change them. They became maybe conceptually Christians. I mean, they kind of generally agreed with the overall concepts, but they weren't really in a place where they wanted to commit to it, especially when it became difficulty. They became like a seed that falls upon the rocks and it sprouts up for a moment, but because it has no root, it withers away very, very quickly. And I was guilty of trying to create that kind of messaging myself at one point. I did it for about 2 years, and I realized that I had a tremendous increase in attendance, but a dramatic decrease in disciples. And I made a critical decision at that point. I just told my leaders, we're going back to verse by verse, chapter by chapter teaching, because people don't get it. Well, it's not surprising that there were a lot of people who moved on because they liked a more entertaining service. But the point was that they weren't people who were really willing to go the distance. They weren't, as somebody once put it, they weren't the kind of lumber that you can build with. And so you who do construction work, even amateurishly like me, you know that when you go to Home Depot or Lowe's or Ziggy's or one of your construction lumber yards, that you pick through the pile. You know, you find that not all those pieces of 2x4, 2x6 are straight and not riddled with knots. And so you go through the pile and you pick the ones that really are going to give you some structural integrity when you build whatever it's you're putting up. And I think that's simply the way it is in the Christian life, that we have to understand that not everybody is really in a place where they're willing to allow God to refine them, to trim them down and finish them off and make them a usable piece of timber that can help to build his kingdom. And so, you know, we have to leave that selecting to Jesus. But the fact of the matter is, we shouldn't modify our message and present a gospel that leaves out certain key parts. The fact that there is a heaven and that there's a hell, that there's sin and there's consequences for sin. There are rewards for faithfulness, but there's consequences for unfaithfulness. There's something about speaking the truth, and there's quite another thing called speaking lies. And so it's critically important that we understand that when we seek to follow Christ and we speak the truth, part of that means that we're going to go through some suffering ourselves, that we're not going to be necessarily liked or applauded or appreciated for what we do. So that's why he finishes off by saying he is our example. I mean, he's the one we should look at. So when we study the scriptures, we look at him, not other people, not even other Christians. We look at Jesus as our primary example, because every other one person is flawed. And this is something that he says we are called to and we should follow. And that's what it really comes down to, is that Jesus said, follow me. And part of the following is what we find in Matthew 24:16. He says, if any man will come after me, will follow me, he has to deny himself. In other words, we have to give up on our dreams for our best life now and go wherever he takes us. We have to deny ourselves our own self-will and say, Lord, no, your will be done. We need to pick up our cross, which is not a attractive picture. It doesn't mean buying a nice pendant to hang around your neck. It means that you begin to take on the burdens that Christ took on, and then you follow him wherever that leads. And that's, you know, somebody once put it to me really well. He said, you know, if you had to carry a cross on your shoulder, just the transit beam would weigh about 80 pounds. It takes all of your concentration, effort, and energy just to carry that. You don't have time to be looking around or doing other things. And that's what we have to understand about this call. Well, I'm sorry, I got a little carried away with myself. Must be the t-shirt, but we'll continue this conversation tomorrow. Many blessings.